Hello, everybody. This is Gary Matheny. Going for a closer look today. I saw a commercial the other day, and the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, Tim Walz, was like in this commercial on my computer, probably on YouTube, and he like stuck his face right in the middle of the camera. Is like overwhelming a little bit, and I figured, well, it may be scary, it may not help, but I have decided to move the camera a little bit closer today and make it a little bit more something personal or whatever. But anyhow, whether it works for Mr. Walz or not, I guess still remains to be seen. But it was like an overwhelming feeling to have this guy stick his face right directly in front of the camera and, of course, appeal for money. Well, it's August 2024, and the Liberty Observatory continues to march on in the observation of liberty. This is episode 16, and this program is dedicated to observing liberty to try and help people become free, not only from the inside, but also from the outside. Or, to put it another way, not only from the outside, but from the inside. So unlike a lot of other YouTube channels, they're entertaining and much greater political insight, much greater professional technology. This particular YouTube channel relates to you. It relates to changing you so that you can be free. And so a lot of other great YouTube channels will entertain you and divert you and show you how to be strong and muscular or thin down to your ideal weight. But this particular YouTube channel relates to you being free. You finding it, you keeping it, and you asserting it through the course of your life. So today, in episode 16, we are going to ask a political philosophical question, which is not asked very much, but should be asked more. And that question is there such a thing as good government? Is there good government? All right, so let's give us a little bit of background information. I'm going to tell you what I believe to be a truth as it relates to government. All government is coercive. All forms of government are coercive. Typically, a government purpose is to get people to do what they ordinarily would not do. And with the understanding or belief that it's for, generally speaking, the greater overall good of the community, that government is looking out for the greater overall good of the community. But at the end of the day, all government, all forms of government are coercive. And so how are they coercive? Well, look at our taxes. Our tax structure is almost unfathomable, inexplicable, and so complicated that I can't enumerate each and every form of taxation that envelops our life. My Social Security gets taxed. My IRA accounts, when I take a withdrawal, gets taxed. My income, of course, is taxed. My real property is taxed. My personal property is taxed. When I buy an automobile, it's taxed. When I do yada, 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 there's special schools, there's regular public schools, there's ambulance districts, there's library districts, there's federal government, there's state government, there's local government, there's county government, there's city government, and it goes on and on and on, and almost all these entities are taxing entities. And yet, we American people are very patient people and very civil people. We belly up to the bar. We may grumble. We may be unhappy, but we are taxed heavily. Well, how else is government coercive? Well, another major way in our country relates to rules and regulations. There are so many rules and regulations when you wrap around all these governmental entities that surround us in life, and then you include all their rules and regulations. It's mind-boggling. In fact, I have had conversations with other lawyers about law, the federal law, the state law, the local law, rules and regulations that implement the law, and a whole panoply of things, judicial law, yada, 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 that affect our life. And we have come to a general conclusion in the lawyers I've spoke with that chances are every day we are breaking a law or multiple laws. Just in living our life and trying to be law-abiding citizens, we are breaking the law. And guess what, fellow American? You are too in your average run-a-day life. As you go in and out of your activities, chances are you are breaking the law in one form or fashion as another, which should cause an element of consternation. Because if you have a powerful government, an aggressive prosecutor that is targeting you, that has decided for whatever reason to go after you with the full power of the state, it'll catch you in something, So don't think that you're immune from prosecutorial powers of the state, the criminal law, the administrative law, and all these other subsets of the power of the government to impact and control your life. Well, how about this aspect? The threat of force. When a government has a threat of force, it is a very strong motivating factor to comply. And I don't even know whether this is real or not. I've never heard it explained or seen in the mainstream media, and that relates to what I call the threat of force. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. I saw a video where supposedly in a major American city during the COVID shutdown, law enforcement would go out on the streets with paintball guns and shoot people with paintballs if they were on the street because it was a shutdown and they were supposed to be inside their house. So that is the threat of force, that the government can, shoot you with a paintball, and then what's behind that? An implied threat that maybe we could be back at another time with a lot more lethal weapon than a simply a paintball bullet or ball. Or how about this? The arresting of dissenters. In one major American city, and there's examples in every major American city that went headlong into the shutdown during the COVID pandemic. But there was a lady that owned a coffee shop in a major American city, self-employed, one part of a big chain, and her customers wanted to get out occasionally and go get a cup of coffee. They wanted her to keep open. And she decided, because she needed to pay her bills, to stay open during the pandemic and sell coffee. And she wound up getting arrested and prosecuted and spent 30 days in jail. And this was little old grandma, self-employed grandma that ran a little coffee shop in a major American city, spending 30 days in jail because she wanted to serve coffee during the pandemic. Doesn't the government understand that some people need to get out and walk down the street and get a cup of coffee even during the pandemic. You can't lock everybody up, figuratively or literally. There's an old saying about cabin fever. And you can, in Missouri where I'm at, I love March because that's when spring starts blooming, and I want to get out. I want to go on a road trip. And I do. I go somewhere and I do something because I've been sitting around for 2 months, maybe 2.5 months, and not doing very much because of the winters. And so when March hits, I want to get out. Cabin fever. Same thing happened during COVID. For the mental health and well-being of the overall human, they needed to get out and do some stuff. And I'm not saying get out and cough on people intentionally and stuff like that. I'm basically saying allow us a little freedom in the midst of even a pandemic. So that is the threat of force. Now let's go to actual force. Well, there is direct force, like the American Civil War, where there was actual uniformed force between the North and the South. And direct force is normally, historically, the way that governing bodies engage with each other in a violent way to take over or overrun a particular group of people in the name of whatever they wanted to label it. Of course, they tend to use a lot of euphemisms, for the glory of Rome or whatever. And so basically, direct force may be one of the most impactful forms of government coercion. Then you have force by proxy. Force by proxy is normally third parties. In other words, you have one governing body that's backing another governing body to militarily or otherwise, philosophically, culturally, etc., to influence, overtake, or at least weaken another government, another form of government. And so basically think about the Iran's backing of Hamas. I think we all know it's generally accepted in the press that Hamas is being subsidized by other Arab entities, including the country of Iran, which is Persian, but there are other Islamic entities that are subsidizing Hamas so they can wage their war against Israel. That is a proxy war. Iran does not have to have a direct war with Israel as long as they've got third party Hamas fighting their battle for them. Or how about this? United States versus Ukraine. Is the United States fighting a proxy war in Ukraine? Most Americans aren't real happy about Russia, aren't real happy about Vladimir Putin, and aren't real understanding of Ukraine. And so this is a faraway war that doesn't make sense on a number of different levels, and we are pouring billions of dollars in the defense of Ukraine. And Ukraine has a very corrupt oligarchical history. And so you wonder, where's the money going? Is it going into the actual war effort, or is it going into lining the pockets of others, like the U.S. military-industrial complex? They're happy to produce as much military weaponry as possible. And so the question is the Ukraine war a proxy war with the United States involved, not directly, but using Ukrainian people as a source of weaponry against the Russians? All right, then you go to a third category, and I've named the third category riots and mayhem. Riots and mayhem are the most out of control things and the least predictable things, and maybe the most spontaneous things. Think in terms of Kristallnacht. If you remember in the late 1930s, may have been about 1940, as the Germans, the Nazis, were evacuating and persecuting the Jewish people, not only from Germany, but from Austria and other Eastern countries in, I guess, would be Eastern Europe. And so it'd be like Poland and Czechoslovakia and those countries. And so they were actively persecuting the Jews. In fact, it was genocidal. But anyhow, Kristallnacht was early on in the process, and it's called the Night of the Broken Glass. And that's when Nazis and other German citizens took to the streets and just plundered and pillaged German businesses, destroyed their property, broke their glass windows, and otherwise put the Jews one step further into annihilation. Kristallnacht. Another one in America going on perhaps even today. If you drive into a major American city in the Northwest, Seattle or Portland, you may encounter Antifa. Antifa has seized whole blocks in certain major American cities where basically law enforcement stands down and Antifa runs certain blocks in certain cities in the Pacific Northwest. And so how have they done that? They've done that under the threat of violence, under riots and mayhem. Because if you try and drive through those neighborhoods, those blocks, they're going to stop you. They're going to throw rocks at you. They're going to hit your car with various stuff. They're going to make your car stop, and then they're going to drag you out. They're going to call you a bunch of names, and you'll be lucky if you don't get the hell beat out of you. So let's take another look here. We talked about the coercion of government. Let's all agree that government is coercive. Well, how about what is necessary government? What government is necessary? Because we do need a necessary government. Just because I'm trying to lay the foundation that there's no good government, we still have necessary government. For instance, utilities. When we plug in our television set, we want electricity, so we want utilities put in our subdivision. And that requires some type of governmental action or oversight. Our regulations associated with utility companies. Or how about infrastructure? When we cross from one side of the river to the other, we want to have a bridge. And generally speaking, you don't, on your own, build a boat and then jump in the boat and then take it across the river. And that's how you cross the river. Well, typically you get in your car and you drive across a bridge, infrastructure. And so that is a necessary form of government, is infrastructure. Common defense, to provide a common defense for the citizens. Me and my old 12-gauge shotgun, which is probably 100 years old or thereabouts, I'm not going to be real good at common defense. It's kind of one of those things that we need a military to provide a common defense. Now, how big and how aggressive that military is another issue. But we need government to provide a common defense if we're to live in the same culture and freedom that we enjoy today. And then we have health and safety. We need some health and safety, reasonable health and safety laws. For instance, I remember back in the 1980s, I was living in St. Louis, and there was this creek over in Sauget, Illinois. That Sauget was like the industrial armpit of the Midwest, a terrible different industrial processes going on. Well, one of the local camera crews from a television station went over there one evening, and I swear, I hope they didn't embellish this. In 1980, they couldn't really embellish it very much because it didn't have all this CGI stuff going on. And so basically, The little creek that ran through Sauget, it glowed at night. Oh God. So it's kind of scary when you walk out to your little neighborhood creek and it's glowing at night. You wonder, what does this mean? So anyhow, health and safety is a reasonable course of action for necessary government. We do need to have that. And then I'll add one with a question mark, and that is the welfare net. And so the welfare net may or may not be part of necessary government. I put it in necessary government. And the whole concept is that those who are so severely disabled that they cannot work should be cared for. They should get something. The government dole is an old word, something going to them, a check going to them to help them maintain some standard of living. Where that is remains a debatable question. And so some people, some of my friends who don't even believe in the welfare net, they tend to believe, well, all that should be covered by private individuals, families, churches, benevolence organizations, fraternal organizations. Like, for instance, we've got one organization called the Lions Club, and they specialize in providing glasses for poor people. And so, all these charitable organizations are helpful, but at the end of the day, I throw the welfare net into government necessity. Now, that's different than the welfare state. The welfare state is government basically, everybody gets a check for almost any reason all the time. In other words, that's what it kind of grows into, is that the welfare state is there to take care of everybody. It's frankly unfair to people who are severely disabled who actually need that money for able-bodied people to take welfare from the government. In other words, people like me, even at 71 years old, work, Gary. Now, I can't work as hard as I used to, but I can still work. I can still be productive. And so, if the government's busy paying me a whole bunch of money for whatever, how much does that leave for the poor guy down the street that he opens his refrigerator door and doesn't find anything in it? So people that are so severely disabled that they can't work comprise the welfare net and should receive assistance. The rest of us who can work should work. Now let's take a look at good government. What is good? What is good? Did you ever notice that the word good somehow it lacks a very firm foundation, or it's somewhat indefinable? In other words, if we were to go out on the street today and ask 20 people, what is good government? I bet we would get 20 different answers. And so it's a very flexible concept where there may be very little agreement as to what actually is. And so when we talk about good government, like so many people do, good government needs to do good, what do they mean? Because it has such an elastic meaning. Well, let's look into a few forms of government. Capitalism. Capitalism is more or less the type of government that we live in the United States of America. It's basically based upon capital formation, labor mixing with that capital formation to produce a product or a good, and that is sold on the market for profit. It envelops concepts of entrepreneurial spirit, like how to build a better mousetrap, free enterprise, and basically most capitalists don't look towards the government in the classical sense. They look towards the profit and loss sheet. How do I make money? How do I prosper in the private sector serving other people? So let's go now to the regulated state, and this is probably most accurately describes the current affair in the United States of America. Regulated state means that there's still private ownership of property, but it's highly regulated. Take, for instance, the pharmaceutical industry. They just can't throw any old thing out there and say, okay, this will help your sinus condition. There's a process they have to go through in order to get FDA approval, Food and Drug Administration approval. It is a regulated industry, but private ownership. Or how about automobiles? Automobiles have to meet a certain criteria as far as miles per gallon, or emission standards. And what we're going to move into are the standards relating to electrical automobiles. And so we're moving in that direction. How that'll affect the market, I don't know. I frankly hope that the movement for electrical automobiles will not receive government subsidy, but if it can compete in the open market, more power to it. Spoken like a true capitalist. How about socialism? Socialism is state ownership of the means of production. And so a regulated state basically says you get your private means of production, but we're going to regulate it. And then socialism is basically the state ownership of means of production. It'd be like if you talk about pharmaceuticals, instead of having all these pharmaceutical companies out there, you'd have essentially the United States government operating the pharmaceuticals. It'd be their deal. And then you have communism. And communism is not only state ownership, it's the permeation of the state in all affairs of man. In other words, they're not only going to handle the means of production, but they are going to involve themselves in every cultural matter, the practice of religion, free speech. Everything is going to be permeated by the government when it comes to communism because it's essentially all consuming. And then you got kind of like an off-brand that's not talked about very much, and that's anarchy. And anarchy is basically a free-flowing or a free form of government, and it does not have, generally speaking, necessary government. Notice I've included in this talk the role of necessary government, and I believe it's necessary. But under a purely anarchical approach, it's kind of like, well, if you want to cross the river, get a bunch of your friends and neighbors together informally, build a pontoon boat and cross the river. In other words, there's no formal governmental entity that's overlooking the building of that bridge to make sure the contracts get extended, to make sure that the bridge meets certain standards. And so who defines what is good? Who defines what is good? Well, first of all, our elected representatives, we vote for people that go to our state houses, that go to the commissioners' offices in our county government. Of course, we choose our elected representatives in the U.S. Congress. We choose the executive, the president. And so our elected representatives, basically, they are the ones we have delegated, rightly or wrongly, to define or describe what is good. Well, there's another group out there that participates in defining what is good, and that is the ruling elites. And I think the number one ruling elite in the United States of America is the bureaucratic state. So you got this huge bureaucracy. There are people out there that have made the argument that the bureaucratic state runs our elected officials. In other words, instead of The elected officials running the bureaucratic state, it's the opposite. And that's one reason why we got government as ugly and pitiful as it is in our country. Because the bureaucratic state is controlling everything. They can weaponize things. They can go after people through prosecution, administrative law, criminal law, other types of liability aspects through rules and regulations. So the ruling elites ultimately get to run the bureaucratic estates because they're the smart guys. They're the guys that are telling everybody what the bureaucracy means. And since we're all afraid of the bureaucracy, we listen to what the smart guys tell us and try and fit or conform to what they are saying so that they do not weaponize the bureaucratic state to go after us. Then we also have elected dictators. And these dictators typically hide behind democracy. Putin was voted into office. And then after he became president of Russia, he fiddle-faddled with the Russian Constitution, got his friends, the oligarchs, to go along, and basically he wins every election when they bother to have one. Now, how about Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela? He got elected, and just recently, over the last month or two, they had an election in Venezuela that almost virtually every person that was involved in the observation of that democratic vote thinks it was corrupt. In other words, it wasn't a true democratic process. They loaded the deck up, and so. Or maybe it's loaded dice, I should say. I'm mixing my metaphors. And so basically, elected dictators are sometimes the hardest to get rid of, because they'll have an election and they'll win the election and say, see, I'm not a dictator. Then you have unelected dictators. And a lot of unelected dictators do wind up ruling by force. Take, for instance, a very, very long history of monarchies. The whole royal thing that went on all through Europe and parts of Asia, hereditary rights, etc. These were unelected dictators who basically ruled the day. They ruled the region. They ruled the state. Then you have, now this may be unique to the Islamic countries, it may not. You have the caliphs, the imams, the muftis, and any number of Islamic officials that essentially rule Islamic countries. And so it's not a democracy in the sense that, you have various parties pitting their candidate against another candidate. It's essentially an Islamic state, and very little democracy. And they may say it's meritocracy. The best Islamic leaders rise to the top, or maybe, like most power structures all over, including the West, the most well-connected rise to the top, not necessarily the best. Or we have military coups. Of course, Napoleon Bonaparte was famous for military coups. In fact, if I follow that history correctly, twice Napoleon took power in France. Once, after he had been sent off to an island, he wound up coming back, and so Napoleon's famous for coronating himself. He took the crown and put it on his own head, so he didn't even have some other official put the crown on his head. And then, we also have these coups, C-O-U-P-S. I went online and I looked up coups of the 20th century, starting in 1900. And so these also included attempted coups. And I stopped at 25. It was just kind of like, at some point, I'm not going to bother writing all these down or trying to understand them at any particular level. All I know is that, at least in the 20th century, coups were the order of the day. In other words, one group of strongmen would throw out another group of strongmen that call themselves the leaders, and they indeed led, rightly or wrongly, good or bad, they led until the next coup came along. So then you have things that originate from the people. Instead of organized military coups or coups exercised by the ruling elites, you have revolutions, which should be more organic from the people. The French Revolution, that came from we, the people. The Russian Revolution, they deposed the Tsar in the Russian Revolution. The Cuban Revolution, or the American Revolution. Now, when I talk in terms of these revolutions, I'm not saying revolution for the sake of revolution was good, because you always have to keep an eye on the end result. If you wind up with another thug that was no better and maybe worse than the original thug, then your revolution wasn't very helpful. That was one thing nice about the United States government and its revolution. Basically, what our founding fathers did, they had a revolution, but instead of a thug taking over and ruling the government, they set forth a constitution and an elective process to elect that representative. George Washington, of course, was our first president. And so don't think that a revolution for the sake of revolution is a good thing, because it may wind up as a bad thing, even worse than what you have. So let's take a look here. Good government versus big government. And in some respects, I'm going to compare the welfare net versus the welfare state. What is some of the effects of big government or the welfare state? People become dependent upon government. They look towards the government to meet their needs. Well, the government ought to be doing that, or they ought to need to be doing that. And what you do when you look towards the government and have that sense of entitlement, you lose an incentive to work. In high school, my dad only had to tell me once, Gary, if you want something in life, you'll have to go out and earn it. Made sense with me. And one of the first things that I did as a teenager, and when I was driving a car, my dad bought me a Ford Falcon for $100, and I became like the transportation guy for my family, because I had a lot of aunts that didn't drive, or grandmas that didn't drive, or even my mom that didn't drive. Remember, this is 1960s America. So anyhow, I got a stereo, 8-track stereo system installed in my car. And I worked part-time after school in high school at a local factory that did 4-hour shifts. So I'd go to school, get off at 3, go home, grab a bite to eat, change clothes, go to the factory from 4 to 8, and earn a little money, and bought a car stereo. Well, that's when things started clicking in my mind. Like, oh, gee, Gary, if you go out and earn money, you can get some of the things in life you want. That's what my dad was saying. A sense of entitlement, the welfare state. Instead of looking towards your own resources, what you have to offer in the marketplace, you look for that entity called the government to take care of you. The bigger the government, the more likely it's going to be corrupt. Remember, I made this point before, that power corrupts, absolute power absolutely corrupts. And so you got a continuum. Even if you have a small government, its tendency will be towards corruption. But the more government you have, the larger government you have, the more likely it's going to be corrupt. And so those people that want a welfare state, it's almost like an invitation for government corruption, because An elected process, a democratic form of government. If the people are demanding subsidies from the government of various types and sorts, democratic process means that that government will try and provide that. No matter how badly it performs, it'll use a lot of euphemistic language, but yet the performance just isn't there. So don't rely upon the welfare state. We get more and more rules and regulations. The bureaucracy relies more and more on process. In other words, one of the common complaints that I see over time is that the typical layperson has trouble with the paperwork. In other words, they're inundated with paperwork. And so maybe that's the government's intent to keep people out of the welfare state. We'll just give them an inch full of paperwork to fill out before we can get like Social Security disability, and therefore he'll give up. So as a lawyer, I ran more and more, and still run into this, where people want legal assistance just to apply for something because they're lost in the application process. That's what happens when you enter into the era of the regulatory state. Another aspect, in my opinion, the welfare state causes you to lose connectivity with other people, connectivity with others. Instead of relating to other people, getting involved in social organizations, church organizations, other types of benevolence organizations, and being out in your community, you're waiting for that check. You're waiting for that government check. So there's less connectivity. And so what you lose is the concept of the caring community. We substitute the caring community with big government, big brother or big sister. And so to summarize here, the welfare net, as part of the necessary government, is workable and doable, as long as we never allow it to grow to the welfare state. So I suggest that we stop talking about good government, because quite frankly, it's indefinable, it's corruptive, and not helpful. But if we talk about necessary government, we can find a lot of common ground and move forward as Americans. Thank you very much for today.